I want to go quickly through a summary of some of the key ideas in development, a little bit of a smorgasbord, a couple of things that I think are relevant and I think you ought to be paying attention to. Some of these things are in the readings in chapters 1 and 2 of my book, Women and Development in Africa. Others are contained in a chapter in the book on Understanding Africa. And you may be reading one or the other, but the ideas are pretty common. So first, I want to start by offering a definition of development and what I mean by development, what I think the consensus of social scientists mean by development. So what is it that they mean, what people mean when they say that an economy is developing? What we mean is, I think generally that average well-being, so how well off people are, is increasing when an economy is developing. Um, well-being is not the same thing as income, uh, but usually well-being and income are pretty closely correlated. So average or median income is rising. People at the bottom are less poor than they were before. So when development is happening, we pay attention to the distribution of income, and a society where incomes of rich people are growing rapidly, but incomes of poor people are not growing at all, we might hesitate to say that economy is developing. Um, in development, people increasingly earn their livings from specialized activities. Of course, by many people might, some people by choice might decide that they don't want to specialize, and so they want to do everything and make everything themselves, and they want to live off the grid and make their own pickles and not use electricity. And so, of course, there's people like that, and in a developed society, those people have the freedom to live that way. So that might be a marker of development, that people choose to lead less material lives. Um, but on the whole, development typically implies and has as corollary that people become increasingly specialized in how they earn their livings. They specialization, of course, we know from our basic economics, implies greater productivity, and specialization and division of labor enable, in some sense, everyone to become better off. A society becomes better off when there's more specialization and division of labor. Um, Development also means there are greater investments that are made in the capabilities of individuals to discern and cultivate their talents and interests. So we place a lot of emphasis in development on education because in the process of formal education, a person is enabled to do something possibly quite different from the knowledge or skills that they acquire from their parent. So parental and community learning and training is often quite narrow. A community teaches its young how to do what the community is doing. The whole idea of formal education is that it's very broad, and a person who goes through formal education, in some sense, has access to the knowledge of all communities of the world, not just their particular community or household. Um, so development means more freedom for people to realize their aspirations and thus have a fulfilling life. That's the idea of development. And we sometimes put a caveat on that in what we call, sometimes people call the Anthropocene era, which is our era now where humans are impacting the global climate, ecosystems of the earth. We should always think about the sustainability of development, because a development process that engenders a large risk of ecological collapse or of global climate change that is equivalent to local ecological collapse, we again might be very wary of that process. Um, So that's basic definition of development. It's obviously a very contested term, and you can have all kinds of different perspectives about what you might choose to emphasize when you talk about development. But it's important to have a common sense, grounded understanding of what the word means. Um, I'm not going to talk too much about what economic development means for a typical person. I suggest you go to YouTube and type in any random poor country, and you'll find stories. So you type in any name of any country and type stories and development, and you'll see plenty of videos that give you an idea about the life of a person who's in what we often call a developing country to distinguish it from more developed countries. But in our common sense understanding, every society is developing, or one aspires to develop. There's very few societies that say we have so much freedom to realize our talents that we would no longer like to increase our freedoms. Of course, it's interesting to talk about what that would imply. Some people, there's a movement now called the degrowth movement, and I don't know that it's a coherent movement, but of course there are those kinds of ideologies or philosophies or vague sentiments that are out there, and they're worth thinking about. Um, Now, measuring development, there's many different ways of measuring development, and of course, GDP per capita, income per capita, is a real common way of measuring development, because GDP per capita is correlated with so many other indicators of development. But development, as we noted here, is primarily about well-being, and so health indicators are important indicators of well-being. So life expectancy, maternal mortality, child mortality, those might be really useful indicators of development. As we noted here, the capability of individuals to discern and cultivate their talents is likely strongly correlated with levels of formal education in society, certainly primary and tertiary education. Primary, secondary, and tertiary education would be good indicators of development. So a developed society presumably would enable every child to have 10 or more at minimum years of schooling, so that they're aware of the potential capability of themselves to realize their talents. Um, so I wanted to talk also a little bit about prospects for accelerating development. And here, I think it's important to always highlight the role of investment. So development only happens when there's when there's investment. Investment means ways of increasing the capabilities of individuals to discern and cultivate their talent. So investment happens when people become more productive, when they produce more things. That's what an investment is, anything that enables people to produce more things. Investment might be a physical investment in a machine. An investment also might be a biological investment, like planting a tree that will yield fruit in the future. And then investment might also be something that happens in our brains. So human knowledge, the knowledge that is transmitted from one human to another human, is a kind of investment. It's often costly to transmit that knowledge. If you wanted to build a rocket ship, that's knowledge that would take you many, many years to acquire and apply. So the knowledge, and you're all engaged in university learning, you understand just how costly acquisition of knowledge is. Years of study are involved in acquiring knowledge. So investment is critical for development. Investment is key for development. It's in some sense not really possible to talk about development without talking about investment, because you imagine a world where there's no investment. It's hard to understand what all of this would mean in a world where there was no investment. It's hard to think about how average well-being could be rising how poverty could be falling if people weren't being more productive. That is, if people's time wasn't generating more goods and services. Yeah, then it's hard to see how things could be rising over a sustained uh, duration of time. Um, so investment decisions then are something that economists, especially development economists, study a lot. And we might always be thinking about what's the likelihood of people making decisions about investments one way or the other way. And investment decisions depend then on profitability, expected profitability, depends on the ability to finance an investment, because an investment usually involves not consuming and instead postponing consumption. So that often has to be financed. And so the financial system will be a key um, mediator of how much investment happens in a society. And investment also depends very crucially on coordination. So you might be contemplating, or an actor in a society might be contemplating an investment, and the likelihood of that investment realizing a return might depend crucially on what other investments people are making. If other people are making complementary investments to the investment that you might be thinking of making, you're more likely to make that investment. If, on the other hand, you think that other people are unlikely to make investments, you might be unlikely to make investments. So there's a important possibility of a role for government and the state to coordinate investments in order to accelerate the pace of investments and hence the pace of development. Um, Let me just move down here a little bit. Uh, a lot of economists are more optimistic about prospects for investment in the 21st century as we move into the beginnings of the 21st century. And that's because we pat ourselves on the back, I think many economists do, of thinking that there's better understanding of development policy. We think that the world and developing countries are undergoing a demographic transition with the advent of inexpensive and reliable family planning techniques such as birth control techniques, and knowledge about birth control, also greater access of women to understanding of their ability to control their own fertility. And so there's empowerment, and it comes with knowledge. Empowerment of women is more likely than perhaps it was in the past, because of greater dissemination of messages and memes about empowerment. So it's more likely to be a demographic transition where people are investing in higher knowledge. They're investing in the knowledge and capabilities of fewer children rather than less knowledge and many children. And that's of course a big philosophical trade-off. Is it better to have a lot of poor people in the world versus fewer wealthier people in the world? It's an old philosophical question, which kind of world is preferable. But I think we don't have to engage in those kind of deep philosophical questions. Rather, just point out this is a process that's happening regardless of how we think about it normatively. It is a process that's happening. People are having fewer children, and they are investing more in the fewer children that they do have. And so that accelerates the well-being of those people who are born, makes it more likely that they're able to realize their talents and ambitions. Urbanization, of course, is another accelerant of development for a whole variety of reasons. Also, there are expanded investment opportunities for transfers of technology. Technologies that have been invented and applied around the world are now more easily discerned by people everywhere because of the advent of very inexpensive communication, and the rise of more formal schooling. So people around the world have common languages that they speak and can read in, and they now have access to information in the form of books and, of course, now digital information. And so they can learn quickly about possible technologies that may be applied to their own particular situations. We also have greatly enhanced financial systems. So there's been huge investments in increasing the productivity of financial systems, and that comes primarily right from digitization of the financial system. So it's much easier to establish and operate financial systems in many countries around the world than it may have been in the past. And then finally, infrastructure wears out, but only slowly. And so every time the world, countries invest in infrastructure, the stock of infrastructure rises, and we keep in our world, our common world, we keep having more and more infrastructure. There are more and more airports, there are more and more ports, there are more and more roads, more and more railways, and that means that the cost of transporting and shipping goods, the cost of movement, continuously is being reduced. And that, of course, makes it easier then for poorer society to accelerate its rate of development because the cost of many things that depend on infrastructure might be less expensive for that country than they were in the past. That doesn't mean that the picture is entirely rosy. There are threats to accelerated development around the world, and civil conflict remains a threat for many societies. Uh, we're going through a pandemic now, and we see how important pandemics are threats. This is not going to be the only pandemic you confront in your lifetimes. There will be more. People in other countries are confronting pandemics, and they will remain threats to development. And then looming on our horizon, and we're feeling some of the effects already from global climate change, which pose quite serious threats for many places in the world in terms of their abilities to develop. If you're in a lowland area that's prone to flooding, your future 50-year likelihood of development keeps going down rather than up as sea levels continue to be predicted to rise. So wanted to talk very briefly, because some of the readings you'll see, you'll have these questions about, in particular, African economic development. Why did Africa in the 1960s was one of the poor regions of the world? Why in the 1990s did Africa remain one of the poorest regions in the world? And why, since the 1990s, have many African countries grown rapidly? These are big questions in development economics. I'm not going to go through too much of this background, except you might Google all of these and take a look and become familiar with a variety of explanations of why African economic development is maybe different from development in many other regions of the world. It doesn't mean that all other regions of the world had similar patterns of development. Most societies have quite distinct patterns of development over time. Latin America, Central America, the United States, Canada, France, Germany, right? So we go down the list of countries, and each one has had its own path. There are, however, of course, regional similarities and other kinds of similarities across countries. So it's very common to talk about certain regions as if they shared common causes. So African societies, for example, many of them faced 300 or so years of slave raiding and the slave trade, both the Atlantic slave trade and the Indian Ocean slave trade, and also the trans-Saharan slave trade. And it's clear that that slave trade left a legacy of for the process of development, even in the 20th century, long after the slave trade had been abolished. I also don't want to talk too much in this class, and there's a little bit of reading about sort of development policy. So macroeconomic policy, for example, in dealing with the Dutch disease, or what's sometimes called the resource curse, is an important aspect of development economics, and we won't be talking about that very much in this class. But it's well worth taking a little bit of time and reading a little bit of that. Last in this handout for this class, I just wanted to give you a little bit of our stuff, focusing on investment, and how you can think about a little bit of investment. Most econ majors have maximized production functions, so they've chosen levels of labor or capital that maximize profits in a firm. So I just wanted to show you how in R you can take these kinds of problems and we can have a profit function that depends on the price. So we'll set the price at 40, and it depends on labor, which we'll just call x. And in this case, x is raised to the power 1/2 to the power 0.5. And then we subtract the cost of labor. So we'll let the wage be equal to 2. And then we have a cost of investment that's a fixed cost of 50. So we'll have two alternative investments, an investment of 50, and then you hire labor until it's profitable. And then a investment of 5,000, and then you hire labor until it's profitable. The investment of 5,000 generates a production function that's more productive than this production function, right? This production function is x raised to the 1/2. This production function is x raised to the 3/4. So this one is more productive than the other one, but it has a bigger investment cost. So once we create this function, so we'll run these various commands. So now we have profits 1 and profits 2 here as functions in R. We can then see, well, what's the level of profits if we had hired 120 laborers. So we run that and we see, oh, we'll have profits of 148. And we can ask, well, what's the level of profits in investment strategy 2, where we invest $5,000 in our machinery, say. Let's say we hire the same number of laborers. What will be our profitability then? Well, we see that it's a negative 3,789, right? We'll be making a loss then, because our cost of the investment is very high, is 5,000, and our production isn't big enough to enable us to generate a profit. If with this larger investment, suppose we hired 1,200 workers, now we're making a profit, 755 there if we do that. What would happen if we hired 1,200 workers in the other production function? Well, there we'd be making a big loss, right? Because we're hiring so many workers, but our production function is actually not that productive. So the marginal product of labor quickly goes to 0 in that scenario. And so we're hiring all these extra workers, but they're not producing very much. And so we're making losses. So we can then use the curve function in R to take a look and see what the profit maximizing level of labor would be for that production function given that investment. And we see that for the first alternative, investing 50, well, it looks like a labor of about 100 is the profit maximizing. Let's see if we do this with 100, what our profits are. And we see our profits are 150, a little higher than the 148, right? And let's see what profit maximizing amount of labor is for our second option, and we see we'd hire about 45,000, 50,000 laborers and have profits of about 25,000. So let's put that in here, 50,000. And we see that our profits are almost 28,000, 29,000. Suppose we added a little bit more labor here. What would our profits be? Almost they go up by $1, right? So about 50,000 units of labor is our profitability. We get profits of 28,000. We notice that this is fantastically more profitable. We invest 5,000 and then we have profits of almost $29,000. And the other one we invest 50 and we have profits of about $150. well, why can't we just do this one 100 times? If we did that one 100 times, we'd invest $5,000, right? So if we ran 100 small firms, but what would our profits be? Well, 150 times 100 would be 15,000. So we see that it would be more profitable to have one big enterprise, invest 5,000 in it, than 100 small enterprises where invested 15 each. That's the kind of decision making that an entrepreneur engages in. So I'll stop there, and hopefully this has stimulated some ideas about what development is.